The first starting point is to recognize that the crisis precedes the poly-crisis that we are talking about. We go back to the colonial economy that was bequeathed to us at independence, which basically was a dual economy, a small, relatively modern, formal sector coexisting with a sea of informality, of non-formal subsistence, basically, where largely women and youth resided with basic implements. There was so much labor with very limited implements, and basically the motive for accumulation was subsistence, and is still subsistence up to now. Because on the continent, still 60% of our people are still in agriculture, and it's subsistence agriculture. Was the small little enclave, which is the modern sector, that was created by the colonialists, especially in Southern Africa. The settler colonialism created a much more sort of advanced and modern economy relative to other parts of Africa. But the primary objective was deliberately to produce a surplus, capital accumulation to produce a surplus. But however, that modern economy was more integrated externally, because it was meant basically to provide raw materials to the northern economies. So it was more integrated outward. The infrastructure was developed to ensure that the product is exported in terms of production. The financial intermediation was provided, energy was provided, the necessary enablers, including infrastructure, were concentrated in the formal segment. In the non-formal segment, the infrastructure was hardly developed. Up to now, most of our rural places don't even have electricity. They don't have financial intermediation. You don't get banks in these rural economies. So that's the tragedy of the economy that we inherited, the dual and enclave economy that we inherited. So the various crises that have befallen us, whether it's the 2007, 2008 international financial crisis, or the COVID crisis, or the climate change itself, it's actually worsening the divide, the inequality between the modern and basically the relatively underdeveloped rural economy, the domain of the majority of the women and the children. So in essence, the major challenge that we have now to start with is that the economy that was created is not even able to absorb the majority of the masses of our youth into formal employment. And hence, the majority of our youth find themselves in informal economy. And unfortunately, at independence, instead of the the further industrialization of the economy, in other words, capturing more workers so that they have access to the more modern parts of the economy, which is industry, which ILO calls the structural bonus. If you have an industrial job, you're better off. Higher productivity, higher income, the collective bargaining outcomes provide you with a better outcome than in the primary sector. But actually what has happened is that we've experienced what scholars like Danny Rodrick are referring to as premature deindustrialization. Deindustrialization at very low levels of per capita income. It's like that basically we haven't gone through the projected path, development path, where you move from dependence on primary towards industry and then services. We are moving directly from primary to services, low productivity service for that matter. So that's part of the challenge. So the challenge itself now manifests itself in three ways. Firstly, open unemployment. Look at the countries that have got the most advanced formal sector like South Africa. They are the most unequal as well. Look at it, 7 out of the 10 most unequal countries in the world are from sub-Saharan Africa. So 7, and most of them are from Southern Africa. 33 out of the 46 least developed countries in the whole world are sub-Saharan African. So you can see the pattern there, which shows you even up to now that the global architecture, especially as it emphasizes reliance on markets, what is called private sector development, development. If we unpack it, basically, it's reinforcing the same sort of inequalities that we inherited. If you look at South Africa, youth unemployment at almost 59%. So the youth have no hope in this economy to find any employment, any productive and remunerative employment. So the issue basically is that we've got high levels of and underemployment. Underemployment in the case of the high levels is reflected in the high levels of informality. 84% of all jobs on the continent are informal. If you look at my country, Zimbabwe, which at independence is the second most diversified economy in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the experiences with structural adjustment, where we followed the mantra of stabilize, liberalize, and privatize, we ended up basically opening up the economy to combating imports to the extent that now we experience the rapid deindustrialization and informalization. According to the 2019 Labor Force Survey, 76% of all employment in Zimbabwe in 2019 was informal. 3 years fast forward to 2022, it had gone to 88%, which means within 3 years, we informalized by at more than 10 percentage points. So you can see the pace at which we're informalizing. So instead of creating formal jobs, decent jobs, we're actually creating precarious jobs. And that is exacerbated by the crisis, by also globalization. The crisis in terms of even the COVID-19 pandemic, as I have highlighted, that they've exacerbated what was already a crisis. Climate change, it's worsening the divide between the rural and the urban, especially given that the rural areas depend on agriculture and rain-fed agriculture for that matter. And then, of course, lastly, endemic structural poverty is basically a reflection of the African continent. Africa has got the region, is the only region in the world with the slowest pace of poverty reduction. If you look at World Bank data, in the 1990s, the proportion of the population living in extreme poverty in East Asia was higher than that for most all the African regions. But right now, because of structural transformation in East Asia, they were able to reduce it to almost 3.4%, whereas in Africa, it's still way above 45%. So you can see there that we are not doing much in terms of creating decent and productive jobs. We are learning from even the crisis. You remember in the 2007-2008 crisis, the IMF itself, the former chief economist Olivier Blanchard, came up with a paper on rethinking macroeconomic policy, where he questioned the conventional wisdom of having just one policy objective of price stability, where he was saying that there is opportunity to also bring other social objectives. And from the ILO perspective, full employment is a desirable objective. So we are calling for, and ILO has been talking about the dual mandate, where basically, apart from focusing on price stability and financial sector stability, we also add to complement that full employment, which is a development agenda. So we must be explicit, we must be conscious about embedding or integrating employment targets and objectives into our development plans and coming up with the performance indicators that basically point the way in terms of how we are going to integrate and the targets that we are going to achieve by certain periods to ensure that employment is a target and an objective that is included in our development plans. But not only in our development plans, because the most critical implementation tool is the national budget. Most of our budgets are not even pro-employment sensitive. So we need to deliberately ensure that the budget itself is pro-employment. That's why ILO is also talking about pro-employment budgeting, not only at the national level, but at all levels, whether it's at the provincial or district level, at all levels of the state, we have to be deliberate and also to ensure that we build capacities, the requisite capacities at all the budget cycles. At budget design is employment deliberately included in the budget cycle. At the level of implementation are those that are charged with adopting the budget, which are mainly parliamentarians. Are they conversant with employment issues? At the level of monitoring and evaluation, are we using employment as a performance criteria to review our budgets? So I think we need that deliberate employment approach. And also, when we talk about employment, as I have highlighted, we also need a champion, usually ministries of labor, and in particular, it's critical to have a champion at the highest level, at the presidency, so that we have got the political will to really push through this employment and ensure that implementation, because quite often, African countries have come up with national employment policies that have never been implemented. Secondly, we also need better coordination between the ministries responsible for employment and those responsible for finance and economic development. Quite often, there's a disconnect and disjuncture in the sense that the ministries responsible for finance are implementing a macroeconomic framework that is pro-cyclical, that is not pro-employment at all. So they are implementing the conventional wisdom of trickle-down, that just focus on stabilization, just focus on liberalization of the economy, just focus on privatization, and at the end, investment will come, growth will happen, and eureka, jobs will be created. But we all know from practice that never, trickle-down never happens. So we need to question that conventional wisdom. That's the starting point. We say conventional wisdom has not worked. Trickle-down will not work. We need to be deliberate, we need to be explicit, we need to be conscious about integrating employment. Then we have to ensure that employment is everyone's responsibility, all the actors, the trade unions, the employers associations, the NGOs, amongst others, the development partners as well. And it is important now to have an institutional framework for coordination. Coordination is critical to create coherence amongst the various diverse actors and interventions that are involved. Then we need also deliberate pro-employment macroeconomic policies. At macroeconomic level, we're talking about monetary as well as fiscal policies to ensure that we basically target employment creation. Because not all macro policies are pro-employment. As we highlighted, those policies that are meant to address inflation, that actually constrict monetary growth and money supply, increase interest rates, for example, exchange rate, if the exchange rate is strengthening, that basically does not promote employment. So you need to be deliberate about your fiscal policies, about your monetary policies as well. And then the industrial and sectoral policies, that's critical because economic activities are interlinked. We need to be conscious about that. And that's where we observe that economic complexity arises from the recognition that activities in one particular sector have got both backward and forward relationships. Backward in terms of supply of inputs, and forward in terms of those sectors that use the output of that particular sector as their own input. So in essence, a particular sector has got both backward and in essence, indirect employment effects, direct employment effects in that sector, as well as induced employment effects in the forward, within the forward linkages. So we need, therefore, to take advantage of our employment elasticities of output, the extent to which output growth is associated with employment growth, especially if you target sectors that are employment intensive, that are labor intensive, like agriculture. And in agriculture, we can look at various activities like tree crops, livestock. We can look at horticulture. You can look at maize. You can look at soybeans. You can look at cotton. You can look at tobacco. You can look at timber. There are vast experiences, just opportunities, even in agriculture alone. If you also add like what the Africa Mining Vision has done to look at minerals, and you think consciously about backward and forward linkages, beneficiation, adding value. So there again, in mining, the two primary sectors, namely agriculture and mining, will actually link up to provide the manufacturing, the industrial sector, through the intersectoral linkages approach. So the issue of value chains and value channels become very critical in terms of ensuring that we enhance the employment multipliers. The impact of one sector, activities in one sector, have got multiplier effects in terms of employment. So we can actually take advantage of that as well. And then there are other pillars, if you are building a national employment policy, like your active labor market policies, where you target specific groups that are vulnerable and marginalized, whether it's youth, whether it's women, whether it's persons with disability, whether it's migrants, and other sort of disadvantaged groups. You deliberately empower them through labor market training. These are active labor market policies, subsidized employment, through public employment services, through activation measures. All that is also very critical. And of course, we still need the passive elements in terms of dealing with shocks that actually can apply. And then also, in terms of dealing with employment, the issue around recommendation 204, because 84%, as we've highlighted, of employment on the continent is informal. What should we do about it? We can't leave it. Initially, when the sector was developed in 1972, was discovered by the ILO mission to Kenya, the thinking was that informality would disappear with development. But however, it did not happen. In fact, it even grew and belied the expectations that it would just disappear. So we need really to come up with the deliberate measures, and ILO has come up with a normative policy guidance through recommendation 204 on transitioning from informal to formal. Looking at country context, we have to look at different country contexts, and there are various ways of doing that. Looking at the key drivers of informality, at the macroeconomic level, in terms of the cumbersome and burdensome regulatory frameworks, the weak institutional implementation, enforcement mechanisms, looking at the micro-level determinants, the exclusion from infrastructure, from financial exclusion, the issues around skills development, poverty, etc. Those are part of the micro-level determinants. And of course, the last aspect where informality is a choice, where someone is doing a cost-benefit analysis to avoid taxes, or some may actually do it deliberately in order to ensure a better balance between family responsibility and work. So basically, they make a deliberate choice to be informal. So the idea basically is to use a carrot and stick approach to provide incentives for formalization, for voluntary compliance. So there is already a body of knowledge, and ILO since 2013 has been implementing the program for the formalization of Latin America and the Caribbean, FOLAC. So there are a lot of experiences from which we can actually gain also lessons, gather lessons that we can actually borrow. It's very clear that the current global architecture is characterized by tensions, by globalization, by polarization, by geopolitical interests, by a lack of focus on public goods such as international cooperation and solidarity. So we need basically to begin to build back on agency. The agency of the trade unions, the agency of the employers association, the agency in terms of the NGOs from below, so that basically we rebuild the social contract based on representation of the constituencies on the ground. That's the first and important starting point. We need also to ensure that there is social justice. We go back to the Declaration of Philadelphia, that labor is not a commodity. So the issues of international labor standards, the fundamental rights and principles at work, or those core ILO standards have to be respected. I think it's very important, because if we are to reduce poverty, we must ensure that the jobs that are created are decent. They are the opportunities for safeguarding labor rights. They also promote sustainable enterprises. They provide social protection, and social dialogue is actually promoted, and there's no discrimination. So I think it's very important to ensure also that these critical labor standards that have been agreed at international level are the basis for a more human-centered globalization, a more centered future of work, a more centered digital economy, or artificial intelligence. It has to be regulated to ensure that it works for people and not the other way around.